The True History of the American Revolution by Sidney George Fisher. Chapter 6. The Final Argument. While the Congress is debating, it may be well to consider the point of development to which Patriot opinion now attained. They had abandoned their old distinction between external and internal taxes, but they kept the empty form of it in their pamphlets, even when in the same pamphlet they were arguing that Parliament had no authority at all over the colonies. In abandoning this old distinction, there was no place where they could stop short of denying all authority of Parliament. That was a serious undertaking, because they had to deny the validity not only of their own previous admissions, but also the validity of Acts of Parliament under which they had been living for many generations. At the same time, they must prove that in spite of all this, they were still loyal. And this clinging to the old and the new makes a great deal of the reasoning in their pamphlets obscure and confused until we have the key. We must pardon them for this obscurity because, if England chose to enforce her laws against treason, the course they were on might prove to be a hanging business. Nevertheless, in the year 1774, they were prepared for this supreme effort to get rid of Parliament entirely. Study and reflection culminated in that year. Both sides got down to bedrock, and in this period we find the best and strongest pamphlets. They went so far that there was nothing more to be said. The argument by which the Patriots professed to dispose entirely of all parliamentary authority, sweep out of existence their own damaging admissions, and also appear in the light of, quote, dutiful and loving children, unquote, was most ingenuous. Even if Parliament, they said, had taxed and regulated the colonies internally, and the colonists themselves had solemnly admitted the right, yet in reason and on principle Parliament had no such right. Parliament's long course of conduct regulating colonial internal affairs was a usurpation. The colonies had not resisted that usurpation, had perhaps not even protested much against it, because there was not a great deal of it. And, as the Continental Congress put it, they, quote, were too sensible of their weakness to be fully sensible of their rights, unquote. The colonial charters were now the great subject of discussion, and the pamphleteers on both sides tore and worried at them like hungry dogs. These charters, the Patriots said, contained words which cut off Parliament entirely from any control of those much discussed internal affairs, or vital organs of the colonies. Some of the charters, they said, might at first appear non-committal, or seem to say nothing directly about the authority of Parliament. But these non-committal ones often contained general expressions giving a great deal of vague authority to the colony or to its legislature. And an attempt was made to show that authority so vague and general must be exclusive and imply an extinguishment of any rights of Parliament. Queen Elizabeth's charter to Sir Walter Raleigh gave him such vast prerogatives, and privileges in America was so sweeping and general, that it must have been intended to exclude the authority of Parliament. The first Virginia Charter provided that the colony was to be ruled by such laws as the king should make, which necessarily excluded, it was said, the making of laws by Parliament. And there was a clause which said that the colonists should have the same liberties in other British dominions, quote, as if they had been abiding and born within our realm of England, unquote, which showed that the colony was a territory outside of the realm, and therefore inferentially outside of the authority of Parliament. The Second Virginia Charter declared that all the colony's privileges were to be held of the king, which again excluded all authority of Parliament. Indeed, such charters as those of Connecticut and Rhode Island, which gave such large privileges to the colonists, and spoke only of the colonists and the king, without any mention of Parliament, seemed to exclude the authority of Parliament. Diligent students also found instances where the action of British officials, and even of Parliament itself, looked in the same direction. In April 1621, a bill was introduced in Parliament for indulging British subjects with the privilege of fishing on the coast of America. but the House was informed through the Secretary of State, by order of His Majesty King James, that, quote, America was not annexed to the realm, and that it was not fitting that Parliament should make laws for these countries, unquote. This was certainly strong evidence and supported all that had been said. The evidence became stronger still when they found that some years afterwards, in the reign of Charles I, the same bill was again proposed in Parliament, and the same answer made, quote, it was unnecessary, that the colonies were without the realm and the jurisdiction of Parliament, unquote. These charters and the action of high officials seem to show that in the early days Parliament had no authority whatever over the colonies, could not tax them, and could not regulate their internal affairs in any way whatsoever. The colonies were, in short, outside the realm and to be controlled only by the king. There was one charter, however, that of Pennsylvania, granted in 1681, which looked the other way. It provided in unmistakable language that the king would never levy any custom or tax on the inhabitants of the province except, quote, with the consent of the proprietors or chief governor or assembly, or by act of Parliament in England, unquote. That was a flat contradiction of the doctrine drawn from the other charters, and what could be done with it? Pennsylvania could surely be taxed by Parliament as much as Parliament pleased, and her people had no possible excuse for their rebellion except to call it by its name and fight it out. Their pamphlets defending their conduct on the ground of legal right were palpably absurd, so far as themselves were concerned. The Loyalist writers used this Pennsylvania clause with great effect. The Patriot writers either ignored it altogether or, like young Hamilton, boldly declared that it was a mistake and, being inconsistent with the other documents, must be rejected. That was the only way to dispose of it, and, having done that, one might go on with the argument. The king had originally granted the charters to the colonies because in the early times Parliament had no power to charter corporations. He had also given the colonists the title to the land they were to occupy in America, for Parliament had not then the right to grant away the public domain. He had also given the colonists permission to leave the realm, a permission which at that time could be granted only by the king. These facts showed, it was said, that the colonies were exclusively the king's property, and that Parliament had nothing to do with them. They were completely outside of its jurisdiction and were to be ruled by the king alone. This meant no rule at all, because the king had now lost nearly all his old powers, which had been absorbed by Parliament. But this thread of attachment to the king was important to save the argument from being treason. It was, of course, much ridiculed by the Loyalists as well as by people in England. Quote, here we have a full view of the plan of the delegates of North America, which, when examined, appears to be that of absolute independence on the mother state. But conscious that a scheme which has so great a tendency to the forfeiture of her rights, and so destructive to her safety and happiness, could not meet with the approbation and support of the colonists in general, unless in some measure disguised, they have endeavoured to throw a veil over it, by graciously conceding to the mother state a whimsical authority, useless and impractical in its nature. Unquote. A candid examination of the mutual claims of Great Britain and the colonies, page 27, New York, 1775. The argument was, in effect, that the colonies were independent in government and merely under the protecting influence of the king, who would keep foreign nations from interfering with them, a condition which in international law is called a protectorate. They could not be brought into subjection to Parliament because the king, as Edward Bancroft put it, quote, had a right to constitute distinct states in America, unquote, and had so constituted the colonies. No power could unite them to the realm or to the authority of Parliament without the consent of the king and their own consent, given as formally and as solemnly as Scotland gave her consent to the union with England. Such consent, so far as the colonies were concerned, had never been given. This patriot argument, however, had no effect. The English and the Loyalists had an answer which swept all this learned and ingenious reasoning into the sea. All these instances of the exclusion of the authority of Parliament from the colonies occurred previous to the year 1700. Not a single instance could be found after that date. In fact, a totally reversed condition could be found, for it was since that time that Parliament had been habitually regulating the internal affairs of the colonies, and until quite recently, the colonists had submitted to it. Those charters containing clauses impliedly excluding Parliament from the government of the colonies, and those admissions by British officials to the same effect, were previous to the Revolution of 1688, by which any power there might have been in the Crown to dispense with or abrogate laws or rights of Parliament was abolished. If the King, in granting those early charters, intended to abrogate or dispense with the taxing power or any other legislative power of Parliament in the colonies, those charters were to that extent now void, because the dispensing power of the English kings had been abolished by the Revolution of 1688, which put William III on the throne. In other words, the dispensing power had been abolished for nearly 100 years, and the colonists, as good Whigs and lovers of liberty, would surely not uphold the wicked dispensing power of the Stuart kings against whom their Puritan ancestors had fought. Moreover, said Englishmen, the present King George III, whom the colonists pretend to be so anxious to have govern them, to the exclusion of Parliament, is king by the Act of Parliament which placed the House of Hanover on the throne. The colonists are, therefore, compelled to acknowledge that Parliament can give them a king, which is, of all other things, the highest act of sovereignty and legislative power. If Parliament has the right to give them a king, it surely has the right to tax them or rule them in every other way. Since the Revolution of 1688, Parliament has become omnipotent. 100 years ago, it may have been the law that Parliament had no authority in the colonies, but within the last 100 years, the law has evidently changed, for Parliament has been exercising in them a great deal of authority, which the colonists cannot deny. The colonists were, therefore, asking for independence of Parliament under an ancient form of the British Constitution, a form which had been abolished in the previous century by their friends the Whigs and William III. In the time of those old Virginia charters, Parliament was of little importance and small authority. Sometimes many years passed without a Parliament being held. The King was then necessarily the important power in the government. He both created and governed the colonies. But Parliament had now become vastly more powerful. It was in session part of every year. The Revolution of 1688, the steady development of ideas, the needs of a nation that was rapidly increasing its trade and commerce and adding new conquests and territories to its domain, compelled a very different, a more powerful, far-reaching Parliament than that of the time of Charles I, who hated parliaments and tried to rule without them. Parliament had abolished the former powers of the king and extended itself to every part of the empire. Just as today, the power of Parliament is sovereign and unlimited over all the British colonies, to suppose that there was any part of the empire to which the whole power of Parliament did not extend was as absurd in 1774 as it is today. It had the same authority over the people in America that it had over the people in London.